I think it goes without saying that at this point, Kathleen Kennedy's time as president of Lucasfilm, as it becomes more retrospective, will not be looked on very fondly. Whether or not you blame her for the cultural collapse of Star Wars or not, you have to admit that that is the key thing that happened during her presidency. And I think that, like most things, it's somehow both more simple and more complicated than people are making out to be. It is her fault. I think you just have to say that it happened on her watch and it's her fault. But it's also not as simple as boiling it down to feminism or wokeness, even though for sure those are contributing factors. What I want to talk about today comes from her now famous exit interview with Deadline. It's the first real update we've had on the state of Star Wars, like what movies are coming out, how are those doing, what is where, what happened to the Lando project. And we get some insight into Kathleen Kennedy's mind. One of the most interesting things she said, and I think something that's been underrated and what I want to focus in on today, is when Deadline asked her about her regrets, and she said that she regrets Solo: A Star Wars Story. Specifically, she says that Solo was doomed to fail because of Alden Ehrenreich, or more fairly, on the attempt to recast Han Solo. Here is what she said in response to the question. No, I don't really have any regrets. Well, maybe a bit of regret about Solo: A Star Wars Story. I brought in Larry Kasdan in on it, and we were so excited about the idea. And then when you're into something and you realize that fundamentally, conceptually, you cannot replace Han Solo, at least right now. And I think she's wrong. Recasting Han is not at all why Solo failed, at least not why it failed as big as it did. And the fact that this is the lesson that they took away from it, don't recast, that says a lot. I'm going to argue that the decision not to recast Han, and by extension, not to recast Luke and Leia and Lando, is the single creative decision that has scuttled so-called Disney's Star Wars. Why it's never quite been able to find its footing, and why, unless some things change fast, it never will. So let's do a quick refresh on how Solo failed. It's maintained kind of a cult status among Star Wars diehards. I personally really like it. But it was a box office bomb, and that cost them probably tens of millions of dollars. This in turn led to the end of the A Star Wars Story brand that you saw with Rogue One, and definitely put an end to the attempts to recast original trilogy characters, something I've always suspected, but was basically confirmed in this Deadline interview. Instead of spin-off movies for the next few years, Star Wars pivoted to creating Disney Plus shows to fill up the then-new streaming service. The Boba Fett and Kenobi projects became really cheap-looking shows. To this day, Lucasfilm generally refuses to tell stories with this core group of characters: Luke, Leia, Han, Lando, Chewie, and the droids. When they do, it's stuff like deepfake Luke from Mando. And I think this is because they're looking at the more successful Rogue One as a model for incorporating legacy characters. Remember what they did with Tarkin and what they did with Leia. But once again, this isn't why Solo failed. Alden Ehrenreich is not why Solo failed. People generally liked him, and in my opinion, his performance is what makes the movie work. He's not doing a Harrison Ford impression, but he's really playing a young Han Solo. The writing from the Kasdans is also really good. If you've seen, Silverado or something, or a Western that Lawrence Kasdan has written, it feels a lot like that. It is safe, and there are other ways you could have taken it, riskier ways. But I think overall the character of Han is enhanced by Solo, not degraded, although that's a debatable point. Anyways, I do think, however much I like it, Solo was doomed to fail. But not conceptually, the way that Kathleen Kennedy is claiming in her interview. Recasting Han was always going to be controversial, but I don't think that it was the kill shot. What really did it was, in my opinion, three things: the behind-the-scenes chaos, the release date, and The Last Jedi. Let me explain. Solo famously had a crazy behind-the-scenes situation. I remember reports from back in the day, it was like 80% of the movie had to be reshot because the directors were removed. And they were axed kind of towards the end of production. And on top of it, this was all super public, and this didn't help anyone's expectations. With all that, Solo released in May of 2018. That was the traditional release date for Star Wars movies, like back in the prequels and the originals, but since the beginning of the sequels, and even before, if you look at comparable movies like The Hobbit, those were all like Christmas event family movies. Releasing in May put it in direct competition with Deadpool 2 and Infinity War. And thirdly, and I would say most importantly, Star Wars was already in a hole because of The Last Jedi. This was the height of sequel rage. Star Wars discourse was really nasty back then. Killing Han in The Force Awakens had generally been kind of excused because Force Awakens was pretty popular and we were excited to see where the story was going to go. But this looks way worse now that Luke is dead, and eternal rest grant unto her, O Lord. So is Carrie Fisher. Goodwill towards Disney Star Wars is at its absolute lowest, and so then you think 5 months later throwing out the most controversial spinoff is going to work? Like, they sent Solo out to die, and then they were shocked when it did. Kathleen Kennedy's explanation here sounds like your typical corporate misread of the situation. After high-profile failures like losing tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on a movie, corporations tend to want to find a quick fix or an easy scapegoat so they can just put it down and keep going. The problem is by not really carefully looking at the situation, or really just the surface level problems. Like, it wasn't that hard to figure out that people were mad after The Last Jedi. Like, wow. It's created this butterfly effect that over the last almost decade now, Star Wars has not been able to recover from. So now I want to analyze that core failing that gets more pronounced in the corporate panic after Solo failed, but I think existed before, going back to the creative process behind the sequels. Problem is that these people, Luke, Leia, Han, Lando, Chewie, and the droids, are meant to be the main characters of this era, the post-Return of the Jedi time. They end Return of the Jedi in the Ascendant. They're the obvious, natural choices to become leaders of the New Republic. This is so obviously the right move that that's exactly what the old expanded universe did, and there's no thought that they would do anything differently. At the same time, they were of course able to introduce all kinds of new characters and new stories. There is the argument to be made that you just shouldn't continue after Return of the Jedi. It's a fairy tale ending, and whatever you imagine will probably be better than whatever someone could put to screen. Maybe, but if you are going to continue it, you just have to keep going with this upwards trajectory for these characters. Luke is going to rebuild the Jedi. Han, Leia, and Lando have all taken roles in the New Republic. Weirdly enough, the only on-screen story that's really accomplished this is still the Battlefront 2 campaign from almost a decade ago. Instead, and this is a sequel mistake, even though it's, I think, more pronounced in the post-sequel time, they chose to introduce new characters and phase out the older ones. There's that Mark Hamill quote that's gone viral where J.J. Abrams tells him that it's not Luke's story anymore.
I only had two cameos in the middle one. I said, aren't we going to have a moment where all three of us get together and raise the roof? It'll only take 30 seconds.
Yep.
And JJ said, well, Mark, it's not Luke's story anymore. I said, Star Wars was an Obi-Wan story, but Alec Guinness had a crucial commitment, Anyway, nobody listens to me.
It's not Luke's story anymore, so that's why there's not going to be a big reunion of old characters. The gamble there is that the new characters really had better stick, and they didn't. So now the sequel era feels like a dead end. Who cares what's going to happen in between, because you know where it's going. And Star Wars just doesn't have a single direction. It doesn't have a flagship story to push it forward. And you can't really have that at all, unless you're willing to use these people, which they're not, and so then we go back to the beginning. Now, to their credit, I think they've kind of realized this, and that's why they're setting up this Thrawn or Mandoverse event, which in effect kills two birds with one stone. The first bird is that they can create a sort of interim sequel trilogy, that if you didn't like how the sequels went, I mean, who did? Then you can have this more heroic, more built-up version of events that happens before the sequels, while at the same time it's sort of rehabilitating the sequels. Mando Season 3 and some parts of the Bad Batch show kind of lend themselves to retroactively foreshadow elements of, like, the Rise of Skywalker, but they're still afraid of Solo. So they're not going to recast anybody. They're not going to tell this definitive story. They're not going to bring back Thrawn to fight Luke and Leia and Han and Lando and Chewie and the droids. Their very cautious proposal is to build the story around other characters who are established. They have enough clout among fans and in-universe connectivity to push the story forward. Those characters being the characters from Rebels and from the quote-unquote Mandoverse. problem is that this isn't going to work either. Unlike Solo, I actually think this is what conceptually does not work, and it has to do with the way that these characters from Rebels and The Mandalorian were created. They were specifically written not to eclipse the main characters of the originals. Firstly, Rebels was created to tell its own story while also serving as a bridge from Clone Wars to the original trilogy era, and it does that really well. The creators took great pains to make sure that the main characters of Rebels didn't accidentally step on the toes of the original trilogy, especially the Jedi characters. The non-Jedi characters take up fitting and reasonable roles within the structures that the originals set up, like Hera, Zeb, and Rex all becoming Rebel and later New Republic soldiers. Secondly, The Mandalorian was created by Jon Favreau as a cool side story, independent from the wider happenings of the galaxy, but with nods and references to bigger things, while still being self-contained. In both shows, more major characters, more main characters could play cameo or supporting roles, like Lando, Leia, and Ben Kenobi all variously do in Rebels, or like Bo-Katan early in Season 2 of The Mandalorian. This is why Season 3 of The Mandalorian is such a letdown, and I think why shows like Ahsoka don't work, but more on that in a bit. What Star Wars needs right now is something that fills the role that the Clone Wars cartoon did back in 2008. Something that successfully killed two birds with one stone. It created a new experience of the prequels, it put new stories in that era, it made that feel more expansive, allowing George Lucas's vision for that story more time to breathe and more space to grow with other people as checks and balances to his tendencies. And it was able to accomplish this because of the combination of legacy characters with new characters. The story was built around the legacy characters like Anakin and Obi-Wan, and new characters like Ahsoka and Rex were introduced in relationship to them. And the story just sort of naturally falls into place. So even big controversial things like giving Anakin a Padawan, in the end, pay off. If they were to do this, a similar type of thing with these new stories they're telling, I think they would be way more appealing. So just imagine if Ahsoka wasn't Ahsoka. Imagine if this story was Luke looking for Ezra and Thrawn as part of his attempt to rebuild the Jedi and prevent another war. Have Sabine accompany him to introduce a new dynamic, but not as his Padawan. Have Ahsoka stick to her Gandalf-type role that she was perfect in Rebels Season 2. Maybe she's kind of like Gandalf in The Hobbit, and she's going off and doing her own thing, but then she gets captured or goes missing or something. And Luke is off following the trail. I think everything they're trying to do with the story of Ahsoka just snaps right into place. I think it has all the weight they want it to have. I think it has the stakes they want it to have if you replace Ahsoka with Luke. Or imagine if about midway through the Book of Boba Fett, Han and Lando enter the story. Let's say the New Republic has put them in charge of cleaning up the Outer Rim because they have all this underworld experience, and they're trying to take advantage of the crime war that's opened up in the wake of Jabba's death. I don't know, these sound cool to me. Let me know in the comments what you would do to reconfigure these Disney Star Wars stories. I'm curious about what you have to say, and odds are it's going to be better than what they actually did, so let me know. In conclusion, this was the obvious thing. You need to be able to tell this story about these people, and it's baffling to me that they didn't take the low-hanging fruit considering how nostalgia-oriented they were. The risks they took compared to the safety measures they implemented, like the plot of The Force Awakens compared to killing Han. It's kind of bizarre what they were willing to risk and what they weren't. And it seems like the failure of Solo really scared them, and it's not that movie's fault. In fact, that movie, for fans, opened up more interesting avenues, like the whole Maul angle and Crimson Dawn. And I think it's important that Star Wars figures this out sooner than later, because I think the window of relevancy, the amount of time that they have to make changes and sort of revive the brand, it's a window that's closing and closing soon. I would say they probably have the next decade before Star Wars is just like, it's just irrelevant. Like, who cares at this point? Like, if by, 2030 they haven't done anything better than Ahsoka, I think they're screwed. I think Star Wars is going to sort of fade. You can't do a hard reset like they did on the expanded universe again. You'd have to let that brand sit for years, and by that point, who knows if anyone's going to want to revive it. So I think there's some urgency in figuring this thing out. I don't know if they will. I'd love it if they did, but we'll see. And on that positive note, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe if you like the video, if you want to see more stuff from me. I'd love to keep having these discussions. And so anything you can do to help the channel grow is much appreciated. God bless and have a great day.